You're listening to Tripod, the podcast of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies. Today's topic, Introduction to Interfaith.
Welcome to episode 1 of Tripod, the podcast of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies. I'm here with Dr. Reinhard Krauss, Executive Director of the Academy, and our mission for today is to outline some of the general tenets of interfaith work and to provide an introduction to the Academy's history and ongoing activities. Dr. Krauss, are you ready to get started?
I think so. Wonderful to be here with you, Casey.
Great, and it's great to have you. So thank you again so much for joining us, and let's just go ahead and jump right in. So, Dr. Krauss, could you tell us a bit about your background and what led you to interfaith work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As you know, and as our listeners will immediately hear, I have a German accent. I was born and raised in Germany and grew up in the post-war era in Germany after the Nazi period and had to grapple with that reality and my own identity in the context of what my people had perpetrated. And so I came to grow up in a Christian home, a very devout Christian home, but had to grapple with increasingly understanding the role of the Christian tradition in anti-Semitism. And there has been a reckoning and a rethinking of Christian-Jewish relationships in the wake of the Holocaust. And so I was very much involved in thinking about my own Christian identity, my relationship to Jewish sisters and brothers. And I came to the conclusion that I really need to be part of not letting something like this happen again. Rather than foster animosity, I need to be part of building bridges and counter Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, which are unfortunately still with us. So that's a little bit of my background. There are, of course, multiple avenues and strands that leads one to one's life's vocation.
Thank you so much. And I'm curious, so you mentioned growing up in post-war Germany, and I understand that Christianity played a sizable role in the Nazi regime over there. So I'm curious how Christians living in that immediate post-war context reconciled their faith with the role that Christianity played in that government.
That's very interesting, the question, because we are grappling with the same issue to say, how do Christians orient themselves politically? And so this question and the answer, I think, are very relevant to our own time. In post-war, in Nazi Germany, many Christians saw Adolf Hitler as a new revelation of God for the German people. It was a very nationalistic type of Christianity, and the majority of Christians in Germany at the time followed and willingly followed, enthusiastically followed the Nazi ideology, which would lead the nation to glory. They thought this was God speaking once again through the new prophet Adolf Hitler. And very few people saw the dangers that Christianity cannot deviate from its foundation, and that is the core of the teachings and the life of Jesus Christ. And of course, the Nazis and Adolf Hitler were totally antithetical to all the values that Jesus taught: nonviolence, poverty, caring for the outsiders, caring for the downtrodden. But many Christians, the majority Christians, were lured through the propaganda, and a few stood up, and they were called themselves the Confessing Church, Bekennende Kirche. One of them was Karl Barth, on which I later did my research for my doctoral work. And another one was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a young leader in the church and also a very promising academic. And he spoke up very early on when Hitler came to power. He did a radio broadcast saying that Nazism is really contrary to the Christian faith, and the broadcast was cut off. It so happened that later on in my career, I got to be part of a translation team for the new edition of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's works in English. And that was also very formative for my own thinking and interfaith work, of saying we need to really think about what is our Christian faith and what is our faith in general, and not simply go with the tides of the time and the propaganda and the possible use that politicians want to make of our religious convictions. That goes for Christians, it goes for Jews now, when the state of Israel uses policies that are, I think, not in conformity with the Jewish tradition, and also Muslim extremists that misuse the Muslim tradition for a very aggressive and violent and non-peaceful interpretation. That's a bit of a long answer.
That's a great answer, though. I really appreciate it. And I thought it was so interesting how you mentioned the sense of nationalistic Christianity that was going on in Germany at that time. I mean, just recently here in the United States, with the January 6th attack on the Capitol, I was deeply troubled with the individuals in the Senate chamber who were praying and taking selfies at the same time. It was amazing. Christianity in the United States, as we all know, has been sort of taking a rightward turn in at least a lot of dominant groups, and amazing seeing that manifested in the Capitol as a sort of statement of we are a Christian-only nation. It deeply troubling, and I think that a lot of people today aren't aware of the benefits that interfaith dialogue give us in order to sort of learn about our own traditions, to recognize when we're wrong, certainly to recognize when we've taken something to the extremes at the Capitol. And so I'm just curious if you could tell us a bit about your perspective on the benefits of interfaith dialogue for our modern context.
Yeah, thank you, Casey, for that question as well. And as you just pointed out, interfaith dialogue maybe needs to start with intrafaith dialogue, namely that we, we need to be aware of our own historical roots and need to be looking for patterns of where our own tradition maybe has been led astray, and learn from the lessons of history. Like yourself, as an immigrant from Germany, I'm deeply troubled by the parallels between what's going on in the United States and what happened in the 30s. History doesn't repeat itself, as someone has said, but it rhymes. And so I share your concerns. The benefit of interfaith dialogue is to be exposed to people who have different beliefs and convictions and insights, and come from a tradition that is a long tradition of wisdom, insight. And it means, especially now during the internet, you come out of your own echo chamber. You are not able to stay in your own bubble. You intentionally expose yourself to people who look at the world from a different perspective, and it challenges you to think, to examine, to be critical of your own convictions, your own tradition, perhaps. That is constructive. That is not destructive, but to listen to one another in order to come to deeper insights. And each of the participants comes away with their own insights. It's not a matter of melding or fusing or creating some kind of homogeneous religion, but to be exposed to people who think differently, who challenge you, who offer you insights that you maybe have not had. It's not the matter of constructing an amorphous deity that nobody recognizes, let alone wants to worship, as some people might think interfaith engagement would lead to.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I imagine that in a lot of more conservative sides of each of the traditions, at least for the Academy, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there'd be a lot of skepticism towards interfaith dialogue. But I am curious, you mentioned that interfaith work allows us to get out of our echo chambers, but does it present an echo chamber itself? And what I mean by that is, does interfaith work demand a sort of quote unquote left-wing theology? As in, is there a self-selecting element to interfaith gatherings? And if so, would that affect the dynamic of these interfaith activities and their reach?
I would say yes to all of them. Let me unpack that a little bit. Yes, it's clearly people who participate in interfaith dialogue are a self-selecting group. They're a self-selecting group in the sense that they are open to new questions, that they're open to new insights, that they don't believe they have arrived in their own spiritual journey, that they still have to grow and to learn, and that they are able to learn from people who are not exactly like them. At times, interfaith work can become its own echo chamber. And in my experience, that happens when we simply get together and say, isn't it nice that we're all the same? Let's have some interfaith cookies together and go our separate ways. To me, that is deeply unsatisfactory when we simply pretend there are no differences between us. So I'm interested in exploring both the differences and in many ways also the differences that cannot be reconciled, at least in this life, the way we see it, but to understand precisely in that encounter that we do not possess the truth, but we hope and have faith and trust that in some way the truth possesses us and that we are enfolded in the truth together, which we seek to discern together, and that, as somebody said, God will sort it all out. So I'm interested in interfaith engagement that is not shallow, but that goes deep and doesn't shy away from differences between us that are clearly there. So I'm not sure when we too easily say all paths lead to the same mountain, when we can only see our path leading up one mountain. We don't have the perspective of the divine, at least not in this earthly life.
I'm also curious about the interfaith perspective on conversion, because I feel like Christians, at least, are the ones that I've become acquainted with. Oftentimes, when there's a group of people talking about religion, their mind immediately goes to evangelism and on trying to bring more converts to the church. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, should members of one religion actively seek to proselytize and convert adherents of another tradition in general? And how should that dynamic be addressed in the interfaith context?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because your question goes to, in some sense, an area that people feel uncomfortable talking about in interfaith conversations. My sense is that if you are convinced of the truth of your own religious tradition, and how can you not? Why would you not convert to another one? As a religious believer, you have to be convinced of the truth of your own religious tradition. But I like, I mentioned Karl Barth, a prominent Protestant theologian in the 20th century, who, and I paraphrase, held the notion to say we need to be passionately convinced about our own religious convictions, about our faith. We should argue for it, all in the knowledge that in the eyes of God we could be wrong. And I think this pairing of of deep, passionate commitment to what we know or we think we know, paired with the humility that we don't have God's perspective. And an additional question is, so as a Christian, for example, if you think you would like to convert people of other religious traditions, and they say, no, thank you, what is your reaction to that? And what is, in particular, what is your faith telling you how you should deal with people who are not convinced about your version of the truth, in this case, the Christian truth? And clearly, the Christian tradition says, if you take the words of Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. So that doesn't mean only to love only people who convert to your view of things or join the church. You should love them regardless. That includes, according to Jesus, according to the mandate of the Christian tradition, Muslims, Jews, atheists, agnostics, people who hate you, people who vociferously oppose you. And so, as a Christian, you have the duty to love other people regardless. And to me, this is where people who seek to evangelize, sometimes their faith breaks down. They cease to be Christians as soon as other people say, no, I think your message of the gospel is really not what I recognize as the truth for my life. So they cease to be Christians at that point, and that makes me very sad.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always been highly uncomfortable with I come from a very small town, and so there's evangelical activities everywhere. Right outside my high school, just about every day at this garage, there would be a Christian fair where they'd give out popcorn and there were games, but also pamphlets on a large local megachurch. So it's interesting and yeah, very uncomfortable. But I am curious, so bringing this back to the academy, I've heard you discuss this organization as reflecting a quote unquote three-legged stool sustained by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on that metaphor for us while discussing the history of the academy and its present mission.
Yeah. The academy was, I would say, the brainchild of Dr. George Krauss, a Presbyterian pastor, and he was the student chaplain at Whittier College, and he used this metaphor of a three-legged stool, that when Jews, Christians, and Muslims are together, if one is missing, there is really something fundamental missing. So in my own work and in the work of the Academy, we have always insisted that, first of all, people need to be able to speak for themselves. You cannot have, say, Christians and Jews talking about Muslims, or Jews and Muslims talking about Christians without the actual voice of the participant being in the room and speaking for themselves. It's been really a premise of the work of the Academy and our vision of interfaith dialogue that people need to explain themselves rather than be explained by somebody else who is not practicing that religion, not cherishing it. As somebody has said, if you want to know about a religion, you should ask the people who love and cherish and practice it rather than the enemies. And so this is this concept of the three-legged stool, which also gave name to our podcast, the tripod. If you have ever worked with a tripod and one of the legs collapses, you know that the picture that comes out is really not what the photographer intended, and not realistic of the reality you tried to capture on film. So we have one of the main missions of the Academy has been to bridge the gap between the Academy, sometimes the ivory tower of the Academy, and the respective religious communities, originally in Southern California, but we have expanded recently during COVID because Zoom makes possible to reach larger audiences. And one of the key aspects has been to offer college courses. I, for example, have taught for over 10 years at UCLA at the Center for the Study of Religion as Reverend Krauss, the founder of the Academy, has done before me. This fall, for example, I am teaching a course at Bayan Chicago, which is a Muslim graduate school in the United States, one of the very few that offers courses for local imams and clergy and for chaplains. We are also offering film screenings with discussions, day retreats, trialogues, where we discuss with 3 experts a topic of common concern to all the 3 religions. For example, the role of women, or what do the 3 religious traditions have to say about racism, for example. So we seek to make an impact in terms of, as our motto says, building bridges of understanding and cooperation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that bridges the divide between the Academy and people who are practicing their faith in the 3 traditions. And half of the world's population belongs to either Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. So we feel that bringing people to a better understanding of each other is our little piece to reconciliation and reducing conflict.
Thank you. And before we go ahead and wrap up this episode, I think it's really important to address how interfaith engagement contradicts the logic of exclusive truth upheld by so many religious leaders. I know we discussed this a little bit, but I imagine that a lot of religious people are nervous about participating in interfaith work due to fears of damage accruing to their reputation or perhaps even their own convictions. So I'm curious how your own interfaith experiences have impacted your religious beliefs and practices.
Yeah, it has forced me to think deeply about my own faith, because when you are confronted with people who think differently, who have different convictions, you need to, at least in my case, I feel I need to go back and think more deeply of saying, what is it that I believe? What does my tradition actually say? And my tradition says that I should, as Jesus once put it, check out the beam in my own eye before I talk and look at the splinter in my sister or brother's eye. So I should be concerned mostly with myself in terms of growth, correcting, becoming more caring and kind towards other people before I accuse others lacking kindness or truth. And when it comes to truth claims, I have come to the conviction that we need to make a very sharp distinction between who possesses the truth. Is it us as Christians or Muslims or Jews who possess the truth? Or is it God who is the truth, that whom we understand partially always? Every religion teaches that God is not understood fully and completely. And so sometimes religious leaders confuse the church or the teachings of Judaism or the Torah or the teachings of the Quran with the truth itself. And the Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel said, religion is supposed to get us in touch with the divine reality, the living God. And it is possible at times that we look at this vehicle of religion and absolutize it, and then it becomes an idol. We worship our religion rather than the living God. And so we need to, as also in my tradition, the Apostle Paul says, be aware that we do not recognize the truth fully, but only dimly, and we are on the way together to recognizing and seeing the full truth. And so I should not absolutize my own religion, but absolutize God, who is the truth. And so maybe to say it in a different way, to me it's more important, not so important that I believe in God, but that God believes in me. And that also translates into interfaith conversations and encounters at times, that I recognize people who have been touched, even though they're in a different tradition, by the same divine reality that I see most clearly in Jesus. And I come to points where I see that reality of the divine in others, even to the point of developing, as the New Testament theologian Krista Stendahl called it, having a little holy envy, of saying, wow, this is beautiful. The person is of a different tradition, but they have been touched by God.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just, while you were talking, I couldn't help but think about January 6th and sort of with applying this concept that you were talking about. I just envisioned the people praying in the Senate chamber, trying to, or purporting to have a Christian perspective. And I just can't help but see it as people celebrating themselves instead of really celebrating God and celebrating their own identity as the supposedly lifted up group.
And it can become idolatry, just like it did in the church, the Christian church in Germany in the 1930s. They worshiped their own religion and religiosity rather than the living God allowing them to correct, what the teaching of the founders of their religion, Jesus in this case, actually said.
Indeed. Well, and it's deeply troubling that this dynamic has sort of unfolded again in America. But I'm so glad that we have the Academy and other interfaith bodies working to address these challenges. And I'm really excited for this podcast because we'll be discussing these topics further and trying to learn more about other traditions and how we can work to better this world. So thank you again, Dr. Krauss, so much. This has been a great conversation, and I've really appreciated all of your fascinating insights. It is a privilege and it's an absolute pleasure to be working with the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies. And I'm so grateful for you and for all the things that I've learned today and throughout all of my experiences with the board of directors and everyone else. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Casey, for the invitation. It's really been a privilege. And I must say, I'm inspired by your passion for interfaith work and for initiating this podcast. I've learned a lot from you. So thank you.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Tripod. This podcast is a production of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies, an interfaith nonprofit and educational organization based in Los Angeles, California. Production by Casey Crouch. Voiceovers by April Crouch. As always, many thanks to the Academy Board for their support and guidance. For more information and to learn about the programs that the Academy can offer for your organization, please visit our website at afjcis.org.